Hi, is this me supposed to start now?
No, I was checking when I mute myself whether it stops. The
Okay.
music stops. So the DJ is having hiccups.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Good Music, Good People. No, I shouldn't try to sound like a radio host. I'm actually a researcher. My name is Geshi Karuri Sabina, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our second session in the Smartest Cities series. For those of you who were with us last week, we began with a bang with Thiresh Govender, who talked to us about smarter cities and consciousness, and it was a barrage of ideas around technologies and how we think about our leadership and what's important. And we're really excited today to have with us my friend and colleague, Thiresh Govender and Russel Hlongwane, who are going to talk to us about smarter cities and imagination. So we really look forward to today's session. If it's anything like last week and what we're hoping for the rest of the series, it'll be thought-provoking and hopefully something that really gets us having a better, or at least a different quality conversation about our cities and this idea of smartness. My job is to very briefly introduce the two speakers. I'll really only do so through inviting my colleague to put into the chat their short bios, and we have those on our website as well. But Thiresh is an architect, urban designer, who I think is no stranger to many of us in the urban space, is Joburg-based with UrbanWorks. And Russel is Durban-based and is a creative doing all sorts of interesting things, but those details will be in the chat for you just now. I'm also under strict instructions to ask you all to keep mute when you're not speaking, like Sean Mayer. Thank you, Sean. And then also to ask you to please feel free to post on your social media. Again, the handles will be put onto the post. Hello, thank you very much for asking for the artist. I'm not the artist, but I just want to take full credit for the selection. So I'll share that name just now. And then also to follow on what you're doing now is to welcome everybody to please use the chat as actively as you wish. It's not possible in this kind of format, obviously, to have everybody piping in as they'd like, but we will be watching the chat and picking up any issues you raise there in discussion later. So please do use the chat to share ideas, to raise questions, and anything like that. With that, I think we are going to kick off. We, in the tradition of this month, begin with the poem of the week. So I'll hand over to Kumo.
The unknown says, our confidence is naive. Compromise. Stick to the tried and tested. Your passion is aggressive, knowing that we are coming for everything, marching forwards in numbers, in ones and zeros. The past has no leverage on us. The present expected us to stand still, but time ticked our presence, with the future inscribing us into history's foundation, calling us by our names, including the clicks in our names and clicking of our fingers. Once not born with silver spoons in their mouths, are now makers of the spoon and benders thereof, came to this earth with answers clenched in fist, unclenching fist to be the answer. Ours is not a race to come first or be first, but to influence and impact us, energy injectors, conductors of creativity, dancers with the rain, proverbs for our posterity, signaling the speed of ideas, implanting innovation, setting standards a tradition. We are outliers, the avant-garde, belonging to secrets whispered in spaces unseen for fear of our splendor. We are resolutely spewing out stagnation, a slow poison for the norm, perplexing conformity. We're not taking up space only to be muted at the table, not just conduits between what should be and is, not just bodies trading into uncharted public realms, but we are tomorrow's tools, the manifestation of ideals unscripted, leaning on the reassurance of the rising of the sun the next day. Let he without foresight cast the first doubt, whilst we visionaries converge at Urban Festival 2020. Welcome.
Thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Thiresh and Russel. Welcome, gentlemen. Yeah, we'll need your audio. Can't hear you. It says you're muted.
Okay, you should hear me now.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, you should see the screen. Hi. Good. Hi everyone, thanks for making the time, and thank you to Geshi and the organizers for the platform to share, discuss, and have a conversation about ideas that I think that we're quite passionate about, but sometimes we don't often know enough about it. And I think that's why we have these forums, to help us with our own insights and understandings. So I think that following the invitation of this, I felt too afraid to take the stage by myself, and I invited a co-conspirator, Russel, on last week while I was floating around Durban. And when we had a conversation over dinner that Tuesday night, I thought, like, why did we not speak about this before? And I thought it was a really good excuse to bring Russel into the fold, into these urban conversations, because he talks about it so articulately, and I thought that I want to bring him on stage with me on this platform. So Russel, thank you for agreeing to this on such short notice and for this. And I'm looking forward to working with you on this. So I think that we do have an interest around specifically imagination when we talk about smart cities. And I think that it is not spoken enough. There's a clear definition about what imagination means. It's about a conjuring up an image, and typically it involves and I want to focus on the creative effort that's needed around imagination, because there's a lot of discourse around how we imagine that seems to be, it's done by some other mechanical, technological means. And I think that we'd like to foreground that there is a deep creative effort that's needed in this. And we can talk about creative efforts as something that we imagine from our minds, like we've had a dream and epiphany and we put it forward, but we're not interested in that kind of creative imagination. We're interested in a creative imagination that is summed up by an author that's currently on my radar right now, James Clear, who you may know, but he talks about the creative process as an act of making new connections between old ideas and recognizing relationships between concepts. This is important for us to look at a way of looking at our creativity that is deeply hinged and rooted in our current reality. It's arguing that what we have right now has value, and our creative effort is not about neglecting what we have, but reconfiguring what we have to make that future that we talk about. And I think a lot of our conversation today is going to be about how on earth do we imagine? So, and where do we imagine from? Where do we, and we're also drawing emphasis that what we conjure up will become our future. And we've got to be really careful about what we conjure up, because if that is not informed, we're going to land ourselves in a bit of trouble. And then the big thing that a lot of us seems to be concerning ourselves with is about how on earth do we go about imagining our smart city. It's not something that will appear the following day. It is something that will take concerted incremental effort. And we want to know what are the parts, the building blocks towards realizing this smarter city of the future. So the way we understand what we'd like to present to you today is working between two very specific disciplines of film and drawings. And that what we'll present first is a film, which is like, as we see it, as a provocation that will be done by Russel, and then a series of drawings. And the drawings are evidence and case studies to support what we think is our argument in these spaces. I think that we'd like to see how do we talk about it. And what's important here is, I think that as with many creatives, we have the option to like create this work. And I think, sorry, the one thing is to say, we think it's important to put your own work forward. And there's a funny caveat with putting your own work forward, because the work, at least in my portfolio that I'm looking to put forward, is not my own. It is work that is produced by others that I just happen to code out. And I think it's really important for us to decipher what that is. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But the point of it is that it was important for Russel and myself to talk from our very particular perspectives and practices. So the work that you see here comes from our homes, respectively. And thereafter, we'll open up to a Q&A to us. So we'll start with the first bit, which is the film, and I'll hand over to Russel. I'll stop sharing screen, Russel, and you can go on your side.
Mm-hmm. Just getting the full screen mode. That's in order. So okay, that's the best I can do at this point. Thank you, Thiresh, for inviting me to this. Thanks for having me. It's always fun. I always kind of come into spaces of the built environment, and I kind of prance around and I run away, you know? So I kind of see this as yet another moment where I make the stop to introduce a number of ideas that we could hopefully converse around, and they could deepen my practice in this project that I'm working on. The title of the project is called Ifu Elimnyama. It's isiZulu, loosely translated into English as the dark cloud. And it has the same meaning in both languages, kind of something that precipitates doom and gloom. But I think of the dark cloud. I think of this dark cloud in the context of technology. I think of cloud culture, digital culture. Yeah. And I'll play now, which is a short experimental film that's about just under 7 minutes. And then I'll kind of talk more broadly around the themes, concepts, ideas, and provocations of the film. So the film is coming up in a second. Bear with me.
ihambe amakhulu ezinkulungwane nezigidi zamalanga emkhathini phakathi kwemihlaba ngidlula udala gwini lezinkanyezi.
It's audible. You can hear the sound, right?
Ngomkhathi angajwayelekile.
Yes, we can hear Russell. Thanks.
Ngiphuma kwelemimoya ephansi kwempucuzeko yezinga ephezulu kakhulu kwelemincwi eyafudukela esigabeni sesine la emkhathini. Ngibuyelela emhlabeni woyise nonina besizukulwane sabansundu ukuzofakaza ngenkululeko yenkanyamba eyabithenwe amandla unomphelo ocishe beyinguna phakade. Ewu, yaduka endleleni yayo emva kokuthi umkhombandlela wayo udukelene nomkhondo ngomoya eyabe ulandela yamanse emthumeni phakathi kwesibhakabhaka nomkhathi. Emva kokushabalala kolwazi lwempucuzeko yabansundu efinyela lithukuzile. Ligcine yonke lemqingo, hawu, yabe izikhwabaniseka. Okulandela lapho eside isimo sesomiso esadlula ezinye imilando yempilo yake yaqoshwa. Leli azange sakwazi ukufukamela lethisa amanzi emvula noma ukuxhumanisa udlelwano ngomoya. Lutho nje ukunyakaza ukwenza kunciphe amathemba kwabaphila ngaphansi. Alo ifuleli thola ukuthi phakathi nendawo kwale mpicabadala inankina kwabe kucashe obala umwebi ogama lakhe linguQomqayise. Umndeni ayezalwa kuwo kungowasebukhosini obukhulu okwakuyiwo kanye owabe uphathiswe amandla okugcina izihluthulelo zalo lonke ulwazi lwentuthuko ngempucuzeko eyabe kufanele iphilwe. Kwagcina kutholakele ukuthi usezakhele umcebo namandla mncane ngokukhwabanisa ulwazi aselwebile kuyifukazi leli. Maqede alixeshe kumasefa. Amasefa ndeni lawa ayewakhiqiza yena ezimbonini zohwebo. ukuthola impilo nokufezeka ngezenzo ephuma kweliphambili emkhathini wesigaba sine enzikweni lolwazi ngobungodi bokuhlambulula amafu. Yona nje idinga ukuxhumana nesigodlo esikhulu sakwamaphungubwe nayo yonke ingabadikazi yohlanga olwempisholo.
So that's the film. I'll now just go back to my presentation. So what I'll do for the next few, about 15 to 20 minutes, is kind of give a broader reading, a broader understanding and contextual position of the film, from which I will start to tease out some core principles that I'm trying to address or work at through the film. I'll start with what we call a synopsis. So it's really just a very brief kind of explanation of the storyline. It's set in the year 1220. It's kind of takes place as it takes place in the ruins of the great Mapungubwe, and it's been recently decimated, and I refer to it as a metropolis village. And here we see the interstellar flanner, the protagonist, Umalanje, who's kind of curiously moving around across space-time, time-space, and he returns from the fourth dimension because he had broken away from what I call iming, and I'll get into what Umungu is. So anyway, Malanje broke away from a group of remaining villagers after a sudden attack from strangers had nearly obliterated the metropolis village of Mapungubwe, metropolis kingdom of Mapungubwe. The surviving few decided to send a group of their kind to the fourth dimension in order to preserve the black race. Upon this decision, a consensus was reached that the history of the black race since the Big Bang would secretly be stored in the cloud. And so a local, wealthy and resourceful Ngomkayise family was given custodianship of the cloud. However, the grandson of Ngomkayise is secretly flying to Silicon Valley to lure venture capitalists to invest in his very elaborate and shrewd digital empire. His plan is to migrate the history of the black civilization into his company's service, after which he will infect the cloud and charge the population to access their own history. It is upon this threat that Imingwe, those who migrate to the fourth dimension, secretly return to devise a strategy to counter Ngomkayise's shrewd plan. And Imingwe have assembled a group of elite technologists from Mapungubwe to travel to Nairobi, where they will work with the local technologists to revive the cloud and hopefully successfully foil Ngomkayise's plan. The ultimate mandate is for the geeks to lay out an extensive fiber network that will connect the entire continent in order to realize the promise of the Pan-African. That's very specific to the film, but more broadly, this project, Ifele Mnyama, The Dark Cloud, is a transmedia project. It spans the disciplines of film, which you've just seen, a performance that I'm currently working on and developing, and text. And these are three iterations that I constantly return to. So what you saw here was kind of this film in this way. I'm currently developing a kind of a two-channel iteration of the film for installation, and the performance that I had mentioned is currently under development, and a text that I've been developing for about 3 years now. So after every moment, after every talk, after every conversation, I'm able to go back to this text and kind of think how I can deepen, expand some concepts that I'd started with. The work tries to take Zulu cosmology, folklore, and systems of transcendence and places them within a digital framework. So Ife Elimnyama, the project, attempts to converge these disparate lineages of knowledge production, Western and indigenous, such as science. I'm kind of looking at science, Western science, and how it relates and works with Nguni forms of science. I'm also looking at folklore, again, which is imagination. I'm looking at the digital, and I'm looking at cosmology. From both perspectives. It's conceived as a long-term project. I'm currently in the third year of this work, and some of the themes that I'm working through here is Afro-pessimism, it's futurity, it's kind of very advanced forms of capitalism that Africa is subjected to and sometimes subjects itself into, and it tries to kind of invite an ontological approach to digital culture. So what do we come with when we kind of think of digital culture beyond hardware and software? What happens when you start to integrate and bring together all kinds of components that make African or Black life, as it were? It currently exists as a narrative text, a performance piece, an experimental film with a critical text, with other iterations under production, as I've said. The storyline serves as a vehicle to move beyond the idea of Western and indigenous systems as being knowledge systems, as being mutually exclusive. At the same time, I try to decenter this idea that Western thoughts is the way to go. And there are perhaps there are four ambitions of the work that I think are particularly interesting or relevant for this platform. The first, I'm trying to think of technology from the perspective of Africa. I'm using Zulu or Nguni history as a way to rethink this, as a way to kind of inverse or subvert how technology is understood, and kind of see where I arrive at in doing so. The long term is for me to start stretching into areas of India, into areas of Latin America, to also work with kind of indigenous forms and practices and see how and what this work extends to when we do this. It's also to posit this idea that the future was long invented in Africa. And so in this idea that the future is dominated by the digital, what I'm proposing, in fact, is that there have been, for a very long time, forms of technology that have been operating on the continent. And so what are these forms of technology? How can we read these forms of technology? How can we read these forms of technology alongside, parallel, these modern forms of technology that we've been given by Silicon Valley? And so the idea here is to say, in order for us to go back, one ought to go back. Sorry, in order for us to move forward, one ought to go back. And this history that I talk about is a history that's pre-colonial. And I kind of don't want to be romantic about this idea of the pre-colonial, but it's really trying to challenge myself to create images, to make pictures, to produce a cinema that is challenging even for myself, one that is foreign yet immediate in some way. So I'd also spoken about trying to map out a set of rituals, ancient beliefs, and transcendental practices more broadly beyond just Nguni culture. And hopefully we could propose another form of the internet, perhaps one that is more grounded, one that is more humane, and one that takes stock of the various pockets and forms of existence. And then lastly, it's to develop a vocabulary of tech terms that we think of, such as GPS, the cloud, and there are others that I've mentioned here. And what I'm trying to do here is to be in conversation with geeks, people that are working in technology, but I'm also in conversation, for example, with a novelist, an isiZulu language novelist who's based at the University of Zululand. And what we're doing with him is kind of, I propose a term and we sit over a couple of hours thinking through how this term could translate into isiZulu. So what you're trying to do here is move away from borrowing from the English language and not to talk about GPS, but we can call it umhlahlandlela or to think of the cloud in a different way. So there's this kind of vocabulary that I'm trying to develop here. And so I've taken 3 words that I will try to unpack as a way of showcasing the process and the method. So when I think of the cloud, I'll first kind of talk about the cloud in how we understand it. So it's digital culture. We're thinking about data sets that are stored in this cloud. One can think of it as a repository, a storage device of sorts, a mobile storage device of sorts. One that is available across time and space, right? And if I then think of the cloud of Ifu from my own tradition, excuse me, culture, I'm thinking of Nomkhubulwane, who is the goddess of fertility, otherwise could be understood as God's consort. Nomkhubulwane is the goddess of fertility, and so somehow through her we connected to nature, and she kind of blesses us with rain. I'm thinking of Inganyamba. Inganyamba is a cryptid snake that it exists in different forms depending on which part of the region on the continents that you're in. But it's said to be this kind of snake of an untold size that moves with a dark cloud. It moves with a dark cloud. And the most recent sightings or reports, perhaps not sightings, reports of Inganyamba was about 8 years ago. And in Greytown, where I'm from, Msinga, a mountain not too far from home is said to be occupied by Inganyamba. And so again, what I'm doing here is kind of taking these materials of my heritage and my history and trying to inject them and place them alongside this digital culture, this digital cloud. And so from the connection of Nomkhubulwane to the cloud, the connection of Inganyamba to the cloud, in some way it tells us the cloud is a connection to a higher being, to a higher form of intelligence. And through this, I'm thinking about, so in isiZulu, umkhathi is kind of what I'm thinking of it as a suspended universe. Yeah. And it's kind of a space for paranormal activity and sacred performances. And I'm trying to think, how might cloud culture interface with this form of practice? So I'd mentioned that Msinga, which is the region of the province that I'm from, is a mountain. This mountain is called Ndanyana. And the top of this mountain is said to be a lake. And as a young boy, I'd go home during the holidays, and at some point there were like these very strong stories of geologists or anthropologists that were kind of doing some work at the top of this mountain. And so I'm kind of going back to those records and trying to fact check some of those speculations and see where that leads me. So it's really been interesting to think of like this place and Silicon Valley, for example, and kind of see where one could go with that. The protagonist in the film, Umalanje, is Umungcwi. Umungcwi is this figure, or perhaps the state that I'm told your spirit takes after death, but before one is a ghost or an ancestor, depending on which kind of line you want to go with. And Imingcwi in my research is kind of, it's described as this figure that is, it has some elements of electric charge. So when Umungcwi speaks, it's said to be some sparks that come out of the mouth and the nose. So I'm kind of thinking of this as some kind of cyborg or post-human, and perhaps I'm doing the opposite. I'm taking the post-human and the cyborg, and I'm thinking, how could I inject this tech invention into this mythical figure. I'm also, through my grandmother and her sisters and my broader family, I'm trying to work with folklore, with stories from rural KZN to kind of further ground this project, but at the same time see how that those stories, those narratives can inform how one thinks about technology. And then more recently, I'm starting to investigate and think of plant life. And so if technology moves at the rate that it's moving, it's only a matter of time that it will start to communicate with other forms of life, right? And so how do I kind of think of sacred plants, plants that have really extreme qualities, and these qualities could be healing qualities and otherwise, and thinking of these, for example, as forms of technology. There are two in particular that I'm started with, which is called umlahlankosi, and it's a plant that kind of moves spirits across time and space. And so I'm kind of thinking of this as a GPS, possibly, you know. I'm not quite there yet. However, we have given this term umkombandlela to a GPS. So I'm kind of trying to complicate and think of these. I'm also thinking of Impepo as a portal, Impepo as a kind of connection, in the same way that a cloud is. So when someone says I'm going online, you're kind of going to this other universe. But I think when you burn Impepo, you're also invoking a spirit that's on the other side of this dimension, at least. In Telezi, I'm thinking, so at some point in the film, I'm currently developing this short film into a feature length, and I'm thinking of an antivirus that the world will be in desperate need of when technology has far surpassed any kind of coded antivirus, malware, or spyware, and in fact, the answer could be in plants' life. Right, and Intelez is a particular plant, or at least a bark of tree in this tradition that is used to dispel omens and perform other rituals. So, right, that's my presentation done. I hope I stuck to the time. Okay, not too bad. So Thiresh, I'll stop sharing and hand over to you.
Thank you, man. So, Russell, can you see this?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So, what I was struck by in the conversations with Russell is that he puts forward something that I was not able to articulate clearly in my practice and career, but is suggesting that there is something quite extraordinarily mythical and an abundant resource that is right here with us right now. And what we struggle with is how to access it. And I do subscribe to that idea in quite a radical way. And what I think is important for us as people who are navigating between times is we need to help decipher what is that resource and how do we take it forward. So a lot of the work that I take an interest in is about how on earth do we decipher, decode, and understand what we think is valuable and put it forward for discussion. So what I'd like to do as a provocation from Russell's work is to suggest where and how we could find these fragments of resources that we could look at. I think that there's a caution underlying in the conversation between Russell and myself to say that we've got to be wary about where we think smart is in our smart city setup. And there's an argument that's saying that the smart and the intelligence is embedded right here, right now, hence our effort to take out and observe. So here we go with a few case studies. And I think that one of the opening kind of commentaries or points one would like to make is that I do buy the idea that we do need to be put forward representations and renderings and imageries of our future, because it's an important jolt to help shift our consciousness. So I buy that completely. And I think it's important to imbue the drawing with a certain level of agency to help us move beyond our sometimes quite limited imaginations. So I buy this. However, I take issue with the way we abuse it. I think that there are fantasies and myths built into the way we speculate about this future that is shopping from really skewed places that has no relevance and bearing to our world. And these are examples of renderings of some urban utopia that a lot of us on the continent are being sold, and we also buy into. And I think that there's a caution that we're having here to say that this feels a little bit foreign and a little bit dangerous, and we're not sure where we're looking from. So there's a concern around some of these things, and this is filling up a lot of our attention right now, and unfortunately, I think quite a distraction from what some of our real work around smart cities should be. And so the question is then, if it is not that, then where do we look? And I think that we try to look at some of our existing realities, typically those pieces that have a level of friction in our urban environments. And an example I'd like to show you is the shebeen in Cape Town that we've documented. And why we take an interest in this is that we argue that there's some intelligence built into this. I think that we cannot dismiss and romanticize the squalor that a lot of our citizens are in, but amongst all of this, we could decipher what is valuable from it. So this is a plan drawing, an ethnographic drawing of the shebeen. I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom left-hand side that says bedroom and, sorry, not the bottom, the top right-hand side space. You know, there's a really interesting setup here about the owner of the shebeen, that she is able to change that space, move a door, take a wall out, manage the type of patrons that come into that space. She can close the shebeen down by changing the type of music that's in there. And she's able to manage this really intense space with such grace, calm, and authority, and it is because of a built-in intelligence between the human being and the space that's in there. And I think that what we are looking for here is an architecture that is an agent of a human being's kind of will, and it's not, it is in service to us. We are not in service to the space or the form that gets put up, which is very different to the images that we've seen before, where it seems like there's this image of a city and suddenly we will be beneficiaries of this. And I don't think that is the case. So when we look at these shebeens, we think that there are parts in it that have very different values. Things like the objects within them, like TVs and pool tables and chairs and drums. All of these components add to the configuration of and the way these spaces are used. I draw your attention to this because it is a far cry from the way we talk about our cities as big metropolis areas. We arguing that sometimes the way we think about our city can come down to the scale of objects and the way they are configured in our immediate home, and cumulatively they become a lot more complex. So when we studied these shebeens, we understood that there were certain characteristics and triggers that influenced what they were, and we were interested in patterns because we think that in some of these areas what we need to keep our eye out open for is to see where there are patterns, like you would do in biology or the scientific field. You look for where there are certain kind of conglomerations, arrangements, and predictability amongst the chaos and complexity. So these sets of drawings are showing that it depends on the type of person, the amount of beer, the type of alcohol that gets sold, and the nature of the person, that will all influence whether a shebeen is quite toxic or quite productive within a neighborhood. So this is a case to say that we need to look at patterns within the complexity of our chaotic world that we have right here. There's a piece about relationships, and this is a piece of work that we've done in Evelyn Street in Windhoek, where what we are looking to ask the question is like, how do we bring about radical change? The images that you've seen before of the mega cities that we showed about, it is looking like there would be some multi-billion kind of investment that will allow all of this to come up in quite a short period of time. And I don't think that we have that fortune, or will ever have that fortune, where we have abundant resources to realize our future in one go. But we do think to unleash this future, it's not about having a savior to come and save you and build this future. We think it is about understanding the existing patterns, nurturing them, harnessing them, and working with them. And what you see here in Windhoek is that the state in Windhoek has very little resources, but it was able to leverage off the motives and instincts of a series of actors, and with a very deft touch, bring extraordinary change. That little drawing, all those yellow lines that you see there, are squiggles where the state has basically said, you're welcome to trade here, and we will not criminalize you if you have a shop in your house. And that is quite a provocative move. It's not saying we're going to bring about change and we're going to build something. All they've done is they've decriminalized the way we work. And that decriminalization has resulted in this. It first brought a concentration of liquor outlets, the dark, bad liquor outlets that are always problematic in our neighborhoods because they are quite toxic and can be quite detrimental to our social fabric. But within an 8-year period from 2008, and what I'm showing you here is a concentration of liquor stores in a 1.8 kilometer long road, where you've got 61 taverns in this space. And that's quite a high density by any stretch of the imagination. But what those liquor stores did over an 8-year period is that they diversified and made more complex the kind of economic ecosystem within that street. All of this radical change, I would argue that this is quite radical change within 8 years to bring about this kind of shift. And this shift was not done by building anything. It was literally by getting out of the way of something and working with the momentum of people's existing initiatives. How they go about doing that is like we try to look at how on earth were we able to unleash that amount of change of economic work in a street like this. And these drawings are basically showing us where people have appropriated and optimized space on the sidewalk, in the backyards, within their houses, and importantly, how relationships work. So that what we are looking at here, and I think that you'll see a lot in the smart tech conversations or smart city conversations, we talk about connectivity. And yes, there is kind of technological connectivity, but there's also something to say about physical human connectivity and the interdependencies between human beings, and the ability to negotiate, to transact, and build relationships. What you're looking at here is what we consider like kind of economic ecosystems along a high street in a township. That once you have the shebeen, it is associated with the hair salon, it is associated with the mechanic and the sishinyama and the car wash. And that becomes a kind of cluster upon which you can replicate, because the pattern is that it's happening over and over and over again. And we think that this is intelligent because there's a certain interdependency between these various actors. And what these actors do is that they keep their street safe and clean. Now, often we think about having these clean cities means that I need to have a security guard and I need to have a cleaner. But if you build in the right level of interdependency, you'll find that there's a level of self-regulation that takes place. And that is an untapped resource within our ability that we are not looking at. And what results in this thing along the entire high street is an urban pattern and formation that is not what we imagine. It is something that is emergent, it's organic, and it is something that we think is a lot more exciting and what you call organic compared to what one would preconceive. So there's a case to be made that if we look at patterns, we support the initial motives of people, it will create an urbanization and an urban form that exceeds our imagination and is a lot more resilient than built in one go. So this thing that Russell is provoked about, saying that there's some myth that works about how our cities work, is something that also interests us. We think that this is a map of downtown Johannesburg in South Africa. And what we discovered is that there are multiple phantom cities. There are cities within cities within cities, and it's not accessible to everybody. It very much depends on your ethnic background, the language that you speak, the time of day that you're in, that you'll access very different parts of the city. The map shows a series of ethnic enclaves within downtown Johannesburg that is specific to a Malawian trader, a Bangladeshi trader, an Ethiopian trader, but blind to each other in some ways. And all of these things are overlaid into each other. And there's a code on how you access these sites because it is hidden from you if you don't have the right language and attire. And this is what we're considering a new form of passport. It is about your body language. It is about how it, and what this research is showing here is how a single individual, by changing their fashion sense, by moving their hem up, their hem, by changing their hair, by changing their accent and their body language, they are able to transform and gain access to certain parts of our city that you would not ordinarily be able to gain access to. And I think that this is the thing, again, the provocation from Russell to talk about the myth that it all lives right here, but sometimes I'm not able to access it and see it. But it is quite a complex space. What that leads us to is, is that there's a series of actors that have a built-in intelligence about where opportunity is, how I will survive in this space. And what we tried to do with Dr. Tanya Zak a few years ago was to look at foreign trade in the inner city of Johannesburg. And we documented a range of traders, and we looked at where they're located within 60 city blocks. And it presented the most extraordinary pattern of economic activity. And we started to see clustering. And this is what we were talking about patterns earlier. And that there were certain clusterings of economic concentration that existed within the ghost or the shell of downtown Johannesburg. These kinds of economic clusters lived within buildings. And I want to give you an example of the kind of reimagining of existing buildings that we're talking about. This is the image on the right-hand side is showing you a 3D model of downtown Johannesburg with the individual buildings in there. And you'll find sometimes people have inserted around 87 shops, 100 shops, and sometimes 250 shops. There's one building that's got 350 shops inside it, and that is extraordinary. As a way to help you with scale, the Mall of Africa in Johannesburg is seen to be the biggest mall in the country. That entire mall on that large piece of real estate has 400 shops. And here we're talking about 356 shops within an existing building in downtown Johannesburg. So it's got an extraordinary trading density that's coming in here. And those kinds of trading density is made available by built form, by an architecture that is in service to those needs. And what these drawings are demonstrating is what are the hacks, the kinds of architectural appropriation that allows us to exceed our imagination, because you do need an architecture to help realize these pieces. And I give you an example of new kinds of real estate that's come in. For example, the type 10 on the right-hand side. Basically, someone will take a side of a wall as I go up a stair and ask, can I hire that surface of that wall? There will be someone that will ask, can I hire a column? So it's not about real estate that's looking at per square meter of real estate that I can lock up a door, but it's literally looking for anything that has a visual surface upon which I can sell my commodities. And this is an extraordinary thing about how an intelligence is built into it, and then there's a corresponding spatial logic that comes at the back of that. And we've done kind of a whole family of what these architectural responses are to what we call like hyper-performing architectures in it. And if we understand the minutia of these moves, they automatically make that big megacity that we all fantasize about in some way. And we don't need to work with the big, we need to work with the micro in some way. This trading city that we talked about, this phantom downtown Johannesburg, that trades from Johannesburg, but actually connects in a transgressive way to other parts of our continent, is extraordinary, because it is saying that it doesn't serve the people who are here. It is serving people beyond our borders in quite an extraordinary way. And we find that along these routes, we're calling them trade routes in some way, that what this diagram is showing you is that from point A, which is Johannesburg, to point C, which is in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, you have to cross over the national border, which is point B at Bait Bridge. That a bottle of shampoo that you buy in South Africa for $2 or 20 Rand, by the time it gets to Bulawayo, you're paying 20 US dollars, or the equivalent of 200 Rand. So that's an extraordinary kind of tax that you need to pay for goods going across this trade route. But this trade route here is something that has not been endorsed. No one imagined this to happen. It has come out of necessity. And that necessity is produced, no one produces it at that mega scale. It gets produced at the minuta of a bus and a conversation that a commuter has with the bus driver. This is a section that takes 14 cuts through a bus that leaves Park Station in Johannesburg. It is documenting that all the crevices, bags, recesses within the bus, the trailer, the roof, every space is occupied to allow for additional goods. So beyond my own luggage, I will put things like mayonnaise, eggs, oil, lotions, cosmetics into this thing. And what you're finding here is that a usual commuter bus has become a cargo vessel of extraordinary proportions, and it's happening at a scale and a rate that is beyond our comprehension, and making this extraordinary trade route and making this connected urbanism through really small interventions like this. So I think that we just want to talk about the connectedness of all these different scales of working, and not obsess about the large mega grand pieces, because that for me is the biggest fantasy, because we have no idea on how to realize that big piece if you don't understand the minuta of human transactions and the spaces that come with it. So I think that the last one to talk about, this is a piece that I worked with Geshe, and I think we're having a critique around smart cities, that we all agree on what some of the components of smart cities are, about being part of a digital economy and all the smart tech that comes with it, and Wi-Fi-ness and response to the environment. So we nod and we buy into that idea as small elements, but we have no idea how all of this comes together. And that, for me, is one of the things that we need to concern ourselves with, because if we don't know how it's coming together, we may be quite uncomfortable with this future that we imagine. And I think that what we're looking for is that when we bring all of these pieces together, we need to know how they land and how they relate to each other. And that this thing about the tech, this tech needs to be integrated with a localized intelligence. And if we don't announce what that local intelligence is, we will be at the mercy of an adopted kind of tech. And we've been in these spaces before where we had a bombardment of another kind of authority. We don't want to go there again. So we take an interest in how the process of adding these technological bits in it. So one of the things to do is to say that we acknowledge what is there, what is existing, and how do we add onto these pieces in small incremental ways. And we're arguing that sometimes when you add on, there's not going to be consensus. You're going to put something down that will agitate, aggravate, and frustrate other actors, and that there's a level of tension that we think is quite productive. And we don't mind that it's not coming, we don't realize that image that we have, but we realize the intentions that we subscribe to. And we can talk about intentions in these drawings to say that it needs to be quite plural, and it needs to be environmentally friendly and economically inclusive. I think that those are the things that we need to ensure that we hold on to, and maybe relax a little bit on the image once we've used it as a provocation tool. So this is an example in Nelson Mandela Square, which is quite a consolidated space, and it's one would say it's quite a privileged and an elite space. And this is sometimes the problem that we have when we talk about futures, is that we assume that our geography is quite neutral and the same all over, but yet we need to look at how those same ideas realize themselves in other sites. And this is now taking those same ideas about smart urbanism, applying it not just in Nelson Mandela Square in Sandton, but looking at a place where there's a lot more friction and less control in the public realm. So we looked at, I think it's Bree Street in downtown Johannesburg, near Small Street Mall, and applied those same metrics to see what comes out of it, to say that we all imagine these kinds of fantasy spaces, and let's see how they could come together. And these have been helpful for us to evolve our conversation about saying, what is it that we're seeking to preserve? Who are the actors in it? Who are the beneficiaries in it? And how does this incrementally unfold? So I think that that's what I would like to wrap up on, is to say that I find that the piece that Russel's put forward, an incredibly provocative piece on to say there's something here We don't know what it is, but we got to decipher it, and we got to lean on our creative imagination to look forward, and we're just keen to know how. So the things that we would reflect on, and Russel, I'm talking to you about this because we've spoken about it, is like, where do we imagine from? And I think we're advocating that we want to do it from right here, right now, and demystify our myths, and we need to open up our minds in terms of where. And we also believe that what we conjure what we conjure from will become our future. And we've got to be really careful about what we look for. And then the thing is about how do we imagine our smart city? And I think that the point I was making is to say that it's small, it's micro, it's iterative, it's plural, and it's tactical. You don't have to have infinite resources and no saving mentality that someone's going to come and sort this out for you. So Russell, I'll leave it to you if there's any closing comments to put in, and we can leave the Q&A.
I mean, it's really interesting that it's been very valuable to be part of this conversation, because part of what's for me will be really instrumental for the film is to imagine the spatial dynamics of this world. You know, I mean, the short film that I've shared is in a very contained space, and it's like 3 or 4 locations. But what happens when you start to think about this community that was super advanced technologically in a prehistoric setting or backdrop, you know? And fundamental to that is thinking which narratives do you draw from? And for me, what's been clear is that the places that we work from should be unfamiliar even to us of this continent, you know? So for me, I really want to go far, deep, and wide in drawing various conflicting and coherent narratives around what this long past could have been. Yeah, and I think it's quite clear that, at least for me, the future is not as calculated and as neat as we think it is. And we ought to contribute to that imagination of creating it and fabricating it. I'll stop on that point. I'm super keen to hear what the questions and comments are.
So I think the floor is open. We hadn't, it's not my intention to facilitate a Q&A, but Thiresh and Russel are here with us. I can see some side chats going on, but please feel free to either raise your hand or pop a question onto the chat that you'd like to engage with our speakers on. But thank you, this is really, well, I obviously think it's really exciting stuff. I hope everybody else is enjoying it too. So yeah, please just pipe in with your comments or questions.
Keshe, if I can pop in, I tried to. This is Krishna Duplessis. I tried to start
Welcome,
typing.
Krishna.
My fingers aren't fast enough. I must say, I'm incredibly excited by where this conversation is going, because to me, it takes this whole sort of conversation that comes from the north, that is about technology dominance, that is about this is how we think smart is. It's all shiny and bright and fancy. And it overturns it and says, listen, where we are sitting, we actually come with our own ideas of smart and with our own ways of doing things that are so much smarter than anything that you find in the fancy smart cities that's being built all over the world. And that really makes use of that innate intelligence that sits within the ordinary people of this continent. And so for me, it's astonishing and beautiful to see how you develop it, how you interrogate it. And I would really like to see how this goes forward and, you know, talk more to you.
Yeah, Krishna, I mean, I think that Thank you for that. I think, you know, one of the things that we've struggled with in urban conversations like this is a vagueness of what it is. And I think that we struggle with that, and myself included. For many years, I think that we fantasized about an idea of like, we're going to go to this future, or we want something better, but we could never tell someone what it is. And when I was challenged a while ago about, I talked about, I said, it would be nice to have a space that's kind of inclusive, where, and someone said to me, what on earth do you mean by inclusive and diverse? And the closest thing I could come to, and I think what I was challenged to do was to say, let me find you an example of this. And the closest example I could come to was at the Zoo Lake Bowling Club in Johannesburg, which was something that was a really interesting place because it was not meant to be this inclusive place. It was in a historically white privileged suburb and was there to support a particular social class. Over time, it was reimagined. Someone didn't say, oh, I want to stay away from this. They leant into this thing, adopted that infrastructure, and they made it. What I saw in the Zoo Lake Bowling Club was just an extraordinary mix of lives, just next to each other. And that for me is a start of something, of just having us, because we've got such a fragmented kind of setup here, is if you can build some proximity into this thing, I think it's a way forward. And I think that Zoo Lake example, Zoo Lake Bowling Club was so helpful to give someone an offer, to put an example on the table, I think makes a huge difference. And what we'd like to do, and I think that's where Russell and I are coming from here, is that we're saying, like, can we put an example forward? Because someone says, how do you make this city? And we're saying, like, it's not with the magic wand, people. You don't have to, it's not a magic wand, and it's not something that's gonna come later when we've got all our ducks in a row. It is happening right here, right now, and sometimes we don't acknowledge it. There's a city that is literally parallel to us that I think has got all the DNA for making this extraordinary Wakanda that we fantasize about. It may not look like a Wakanda, but I can tell you that it is one that people have equal access to opportunity. They are able to make a hustle and have quite dignified and necessary complex human lives. And I think that for us is where we look for it. And then if we find it, my job, or my obsession rather, has become to draw the thing out, draw it out, show how it works and what the parts are that's making it happen. You know, and I think that in a sad way, unfortunately, Krishna, is that these really imaginative, extraordinary places are coupled with a level of stress, human, social, economic stress. And they happen in quite messy urban contexts, like Shebeens, liquor outlets, high streets, downtown Joburg. And I think that is a little bit unfortunate, and I think that it is our jobs to go in there and decipher the values from it and put it forward in these kinds of forums, because it is not, I can tell you from urban planners' point of view, I don't think it's in our textbooks. Nothing is in our textbooks. So yeah.
Mabato has thrown a question at me that I'll attempt to respond to. And the question reads, Russell, do you think Africa has the capacity, resource-wise, to reimagine smarter cities that tell our indigenous stories and heritage, and also bridge the inequality gaps? I don't have all the answers, but this is my attempt. I think the current infrastructure and the current developments that we see, particularly in Johannesburg, at the rate at which construction happens, is financing Western conceptions of space. Every square meter has to extract or has to return a rand value of this. And so I think the resources, and I'm not going to answer who has the resources, but I think the resources, the available resources that are perhaps in public hands can be redirected towards an infrastructure that could carry our heritage, our stories, could reflect our lived realities. So I really feel that partially it's about redirecting the investment. And then you ask if this would help us reimagine our smarter cities. And I'm wondering if we should be calling them smart cities for our context. Do we need smart cities, or should it be others? I don't know what the placement for smart is, but perhaps we can stress test and problematize smart and appropriate that for the needs of us as Africans. I mean, to this point, I through this research, I'm starting to think of the relationship between China and Africa. And parallel to that, thinking of the kind of the tech wars that are happening between the US and China, and asking ourselves, what role will South Africa or Africa play in these tech wars between Silicon Valley and China? So when one thinks of smart cities and one thinks of the influence and impacts and infiltration of China on the continents, of course, they've got this growing and booming tech industry. How will that be deployed on the continent when we already have fairly good examples of how tech plays a role in places like Kenya? Rwanda is on the rise with this. So I think it's about perhaps it's about calling what is closer, what's in proximity, as opposed to thinking of in the frame of smart cities. I'm losing the point here, so I'll shut up.
I think you got some other comments there and questions on the chat, Thiresh. I don't know if you picked that up.
Yeah, just it's a messy one. I'm not sure whether this is.
You're hoping to avoid it? No.
It's a tricky one because I'm not sure if this is a act of sabotage to expose me, but I'll say it anyway. So the role of government in all of the tactical work. The thing is that it's a tricky thing because, as I mentioned, is that these sites of great resource, I'm talking inventive resource, is not the site for convenient political conversation because it involves our immigrant community. It involves quite uncomfortable things that are against the grain of our kind of political stability. I'm talking individual political stability. So you find that you're not going to have the courage of politicians or government to demonstrate or showcase where they see innovation because that innovation happens in messy places. So there's a way to untangle it, and that's why sometimes through our drawing, and that's why we draw in the way we do, is that we take these things out that you can't decipher the real context. You can't decipher whether someone's an immigrant or not. We're just showing you the intelligence. So that's part of our job, is to take away some of the messy context, but hold the intelligence in it. So to come back to the thing about government, I think that there needs to be an observer. I don't think that they observe. They have a reflective lens on what it is that's being made. I think that we're in a reactive mode generally. I think that the one liner I gave you about being an empathetic observer, it's like we can observe very differently. We can be an opportunistic observer, we can be an empathetic observer, we could be an indifferent observer. I think that that observation needs to be biased with something to say that we are in a state of distress and we do have an underlying care for our well-being. So you've got to observe in a particular way. And the second thing is about being an enabler. And there are two types of multiple enablers. There's enablers like, okay, please go and walk through that door and get stuff done. But a radical enabler is saying that I'm going to do something that recognizes the urgency of our time, and I will enable you in a radical way. And I think that that is calling for a level of courage and experimentalism that I think that we need to have. So that's what government needs to do, I believe, to help the conversation.
Then I've got something from Siwe and Dombela. That goes, really appreciate this kind of work. Well done, Russell. Just to know if there are any particular elements of intelligence you have identified from looking into pre-colonial cultural technological references that can provide an alternative to the smartness, quote unquote, being sold to African cities. Unfortunately, I haven't gone too far deep into this particular practice, which is fractal spatial arrangements, which I would imagine most of you from the sector are familiar with. But I think what is really interesting about fractal spatial arrangements or design is that it reconstructs how community is laid out. And from this position, it also means that economics could be rethought and rearranged, and a number of other things that I think in the current state are non-conducive, and if anything, contribute to the disparity. So yes. One is fractals, but I think there's in our language there's a word that I often use which is called ugnana. Again, I had the the privilege perhaps to have my grandmother around for a very long time. And in my younger years, she had this term that she would use, which was ugnana. And ugnana is a word that means you go to your neighbor to ask for food. But it is devoid of the kind of debts that we have been conditioned to think from. Yeah, so I ask for food and I don't owe you as a neighbor. So there's something about how a social contract could be reconstituted amongst neighbors, community members, and nature, if you want to extend it even further. So again, I think the fragments are there. It's about bringing them and finding creative or imaginative ways of re-injecting them into contemporary society.
So I have a quick one. So in the context of African solutions and using our indigenous history and our heritage to solve some of these problems, how do we steer away from some of the political connotations around African solutions, as we've heard the term being used in the past? For personal gain, for example, when people don't want to take accountability and they would frame the conversation around having African solutions for African problems. Yeah.
Oh man. I have to gather my thoughts.
I'm just trying to understand what's the main crisis or the concern that you're talking about.
So just being able to use our ways of being, and by our I'm saying Africanness, so from the social contracts that Russell was talking about, from a community level, how Africans have related to one another in the past and how problems have been solved. So even from a village point of view, right? So how do we reinterpret or use those in a way that advances everybody without African solutions being a political jargon to suit politicians, for example? So even from a tech perspective, how are some of these things? I mean, you take the whole coronavirus thing right now, how traditional medicines or herbs became a popular thing, you know, and yet ordinarily African medicines are not really acceptable in the Western world, but a lot of people were using it and it was acceptable because everybody knew that it worked. So just from a broader conversation point of view, how do we reimagine these things? How do we become okay with Africanness and how we are inherently, you know, to solve some of our problems and to move us forward in a non-Western way?
Oh. So let me attempt. What I avoid in my practice and in my work is this idea that everything was perfect in the past, which I think at times I've noticed some people kind of find great comfort in this idea that the good old past was much more was less complicated. And I think it takes away the complexity of and the dynamic of a living entity and organism who is riddled with tensions, conflicts, dilemmas, and so on, right? But I think the place that we're at, and maybe I'll speak from the position of a Black body or Black subjects, we seem to be at this turning point where in a very short space of time, the world has changed so radically that somehow we seem to be either in the past or in some liminal space, but not quite in the future, right? And I would propose that somehow there has to be some kind of of resolve, some kind of conversation that takes stock of where we are now, thinking about the practices, the rituals, and what history has deposited, or perhaps what heritage has deposited to us, and really think about how do those serve us in this moment. How do we reconstitute the Black family? I mean, I think I'm trying to also contain this response, but perhaps if I try come back to the points I'm trying to make is we're at a turning point, and for me it's less about the past or the future, trying to find a sweet spot between those two that is super useful for the position and the situation we find ourselves in now, which is largely capitalistic framework that we have to operate and thrive in. And I wonder whether the current composition of our society, particularly Black society, is geared for that. And so how do you re-engineer that?
Can I make a contribution to that? I mean, I think that I have an interest in experimenting and putting forward something. So when you ask how we do it, you just try and make something. I think with the intention, just run an iteration of it to try. I think there's nothing that beats an attempt at something. And if we don't have an attempt, it just stays words for a really long time. And I think that if we don't do that, all I'm advocating for is just demonstrate it through whatever initiative you have.
Because I think also beyond, to kind of tame the conversation and bring it into like a small scale and in a context that is very practical, what we are asking for, I think, in the broader sense, is some kind of direction of how we will encounter the future. Yes, it could be at the city scale, but also at a family scale, at a community scale, and other forms of community making that we are part of as humans. So there's a level at which we can address this at a macro, but perhaps when Thiresh talks about like demonstrating and trying and constantly iterating, perhaps we can start to implement this at like really small scales and see what the results are.
So there are a couple of other comments in the chat. I don't know if either of you want to respond to any of them. We're down to the last few minutes, but if you just want to cast an eye there, there's some comments about economic crisis. There's some discussion about, I think by your provocation, Russell, about whether smart cities is the way to go. We've got a number of alternatives that have been popped in there that you could have a look at. And there's a question specifically from Martin saying the more he listens, he's questioning intelligence and smart, and he asks, is this relative or common? Is this relative of common or universally African? Martin, maybe do you want to articulate your question? I'm missing the last bit there. Are you asking whether this is a uniquely African conversation, or what was the last point there? Martin, are you there? Maybe not. Okay, not a problem.
He is.
Oh, is he?
Yes. Well, I'm literally kind of asking whether it is African, as it were, because if we talk about a city, it's probably, I think, a melting pot of different cultures in the first place. So you might find that it is not common, or you need to define that commonality and work within the framework of that in order to make sense of it. So yes, I'm not sure. Intelligence, smart. Who's smart are we talking about? My smart is definitely not Russell's smart. Russell's too smart for me.
It's actually interesting that the terms we use that almost appear to have, I'm assuming some of these words we use like intelligent or smart, they have some link to some intellect something of that sort. And then for some people, obviously, it's translated to meaning data. So digital is sometimes what it's about. But this evolution of terms and why people use them, of course, is quite interesting. And how they're sold. I think somebody made the comment about how these things are sold to us. So,
yeah, but
so the diversity of it, and maybe Thiresh, yeah, go ahead, because I think you had referred to this earlier, that we need this variety.
Yeah, just Martin, I think that's the thing about smart. I think I take less of an interest about how sophisticated something is, and it doesn't have to be beyond one's intelligence, but it's just the appropriateness of that response to that problem that makes something quite smart. It's really simple stuff. Like, I think the wheel is quite smart, and it's not because it's so fit for purpose, and it's such a beautiful response to it, and it's elegant and efficient, etc. So I think that is smart, and how cumulatively you have lots of smart things building up. I buy that. I think that this thing about smart being something that is hard to understand and grasp is just complexity. That doesn't mean smart. So I think that I just want to frame smart, because I didn't want it to go into a point where we're like, hey, we because we don't understand it, maybe it's smart, but it's not. I think it's just about the how well it deals with something. I think that's smart. My smartphone is not so smart because it takes me away from my kids. So I don't know.
I mean, there's also something here. Oh, sorry, Geshe, you wanted to say something.
No, I was just going to joke and say that I think that's smart for the intent of the person who got you the device, Thiresh. You probably just have a different agenda.
I do.
Sorry, Russell, go ahead.
No, the point I was going to make is around language, particularly to Martin's points. Language and the etymology of words, which again carry a civilization's imagination. And so when we talk smart and we take that phrase, do we also interrogate the definition, the articulation of that phrase? So at this point, as Africans, do we need smart cities? Or can that word be replaced by something else? Perhaps something that mobilizes an imagination from one of our kind of heritages, considering that South Africa is also the melting pot of different peoples and cultures.
Hi everyone.
Go ahead, Nati.
Yeah, I was watching your short film, Russell, and I mean, I might have missed the point in the film, but like from the word "ifilimiam," and when you say "ifilimiam," I start thinking about padlock, you know what I mean? And so you were talking about the cloud, and so I'm thinking, Wuti, are you problematizing the cloud, or problematizing the word? I mean, smart cities in a way, and is because I might have lost it in the presentation, and I'm kind of going back to what you're saying now about we need to rethink what smart is. So are you saying from your presentation then that we're thinking about our cities in the wrong way, and that there's a different way in which you should be thinking about? Maybe I'm just kind of asking you to kind of go back to your presentation. I don't know what, but that's what I've been thinking about this whole time.
Yeah. My answer will depart quite radically from the context of this conversation. If Elimnyama was really positioned as a way to catch someone's imagination, I think it's like dark cloud, and there are a number of things, a number of interpretations that come out of that. But what I was also trying to do is to think about what do we hand over when a large corporation holds the majority of the population's information and activities online. What do we make of this world where knowledge is so expensive? Yeah. Is there another way to generate knowledge? Is there another way to make knowledge accessible and useful for us? So I was kind of playing at those questions, and lesser about problematizing the cloud. I think the cloud is here. We have to deal with it, and it's certainly where the future is headed. But how do we appropriate the cloud? How do we tame the cloud? How do we ensure that it's not doom and gloom? thinking of this from things like Inkanyamba, Imengwe, and the plant's life that I've spoken about, and Nomkubulwan, etc.
Okay, I think we're at time and getting into a really interesting bit of and Krishna's sharing some links and I'm sharing something as well. But okay, so Krishna's got a lecture that we can all have a look at. I think this is really exciting. I'm looking forward to going back and watching your video again, Russell, actually. Partly because, you know, the beginning that was glitching, far from being annoying for me, I was actually finding a slowing down that was quite interesting. You know, so when this person is mudding his body, and then the thing is glitching, so it's taking you even slower. It really gives you pause to reflect on what exactly is going on right now. And maybe that's part of the problem with a smart city. You know, it happens so quickly that maybe there's no time to pause and reflect on whether we're doing the right things and whether we really want to continue. So thank you very much for that. And I think between your ideas about new languages and even what's the direction, you know, from the cyborg to the Imingwi or the Umnana to the social contract, you know, which is influencing or defining which. Thiresh, I think the images and the imaginaries you're calling us into and to have a rich dialogue, if you want, and reflective time with these kind of images. And I think your closing point there just around how we conjure up our futures. I find these ideas very compelling, and I hope people here are stimulated and wanting to continue the discussion. I'm going to ask Kumo maybe just to flight up the banner of the next dialogues we're going to have in this series. But as she does that, I really just want to thank you, Thiresh. Thank you so much for taking up the invitation. Russell, thank you so much for sharing your movie and your time with us. The next session the next Smart Cities session is going to be on smarter cities and participation. So away from what we do, we're going to talk a little bit about the processes through which people think that we co-generate cities and what are some examples from various places. And there's actually a network of people sponsored by the French Development Bank who've been having those conversations about processes. So we'll hear a little bit about that. We hope you will all return and be part of that because we see this as a cumulative dialogue. There are other sessions this week. Tomorrow there is a masterclass for those of you who need a bit of training. And it's quite exciting. It's a group that's been doing digital activism, and we'll be hearing about how they've been using civic tech to really engage in public meetings and some case studies from the COVID-19 crisis. On Thursday, we get to kick back and have a drink during our Jam Cafe. And I think quite consistent with our conversation today. So in fact, I would encourage you to join that one. We'll be having storytellers talk about narrative and how do we reimagine based on the stories we tell ourselves and where these stories come from. And so we'll have, storytellers from Malawi, from Senegal, from India, and a storytelling musician also telling her musical story. And I think it's just further to this conversation about, Thiresh asks us, where do our imaginations come from? And I think for many of us, perhaps part of the problem of schooling has been that we are schooled into thinking that culture and who we are is somehow separate from what we do in the office and these other very official things we do that are informed by a different strand of theory from who we are. And so what I like about, I think, the mix this week is maybe pulling ourselves closer to themselves, maybe linking us to our history, not making it something we have to buy down the line. And so for me, these ideas are really exciting. So please welcome to join us for any of those events. Is there anything else I'm supposed to say, folks? I believe the video from this session will be available on our website and on the Urban Festival website by next week. And we encourage you to keep on engaging. So thank you all for participating. Thank you to our speakers. And I guess Kumo's going to send us out with some dance music. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.